Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Tatro. I'm the director of Ford's Theater. Welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight on behalf of Ford's Theater community. I offer a warm welcome to Mayor Sharon Pratt, Michael Steele, and historians Dr. Christopher Bona and Dr. Michael Burlingame. At Ford's, we explore the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and celebrate the American experience through theater and education. We are happy to host the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History's Lincoln, a Providential President, as part of their Defining Fathers series. As organizations, we share a love of history, education, and an appreciation for the humanities. When the idea of this program was first brought to our attention, I knew that it had to take place at Ford's Theater. Today, Lincoln's consequential legacy continues to instruct, illuminate, and inspire people across the world. In many ways, this is why we have gathered this evening, to investigate, to learn, to be inspired, and to be reminded of who President Lincoln was. I thank you all for being in attendance. One bit of housekeeping before we continue on. I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your phones. It'll make for a much more enjoyable evening for everyone. And please help me welcome to the stage Shanna Bartley, the Policy Director at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Shanna.
Thank you, Paul. We would not be here without your bold leadership as director of Ford's Theater. We are grateful to be at this historic and sacred site where tonight we launch the Defining Fathers series. My name is Shauna Bartley. I'm a policy officer for the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. While the foundation is located in Mr. Kellogg's hometown of Battle Creek, Michigan, I am proud to call Washington, D.C. my home. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History's presentation of Lincoln, a Providential President. Tonight's dramatic reflections and panel discussion with eminent historians will take us on an eye-opening journey about the evolution of President Abraham Lincoln. His vision for a stronger union, eloquence, humility, and legacy of leadership have enabled him to become known as one of the most inspiring leaders in American history. Just as we were proud to support IPPH's Founding Fathers series last year, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation is proud to support the Defining Fathers series this year. The event kicks off the Defining Fathers series, a compelling mix of vodcasts and in-person live-streamed programs. It reveals the depth of the lives, motivations, and contradictions of President Abraham Lincoln, President Ulysses S. Grant, and freedom advocate Frederick Douglass. These leaders played pivotal roles in transforming the nation's capital from a small country town into a metropolis. Their collective efforts to preserve the United States, abolish slavery, work towards equal citizenship for all, and reconstruct a bitterly divided but legally emancipated America led to the city and the country we have today. This series builds on the dialogue from last year that examined the lives of Presidents Washington, Madison, and Jefferson as they were pivotal to establishing the nation's capital in the South, along the banks of the Potomac. Programming examined the economic and cultural conditions that enabled the sustained institution of slavery, despite the founders' establishment of America's Declaration of Independence, affirming all men are created equal. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation supports the Institute's work, given the alignment between our missions. Embedded within all we do as a philanthropy is our commitment to advancing racial equity and racial healing, developing leaders, and engaging communities in solving society's most pressing and pervasive problems. We believe that to achieve more equitable communities, our nation must confront often difficult truths about the impact of systemic racism and racial bias throughout our history and within our present-day experiences. This work is critical to developing the trusting relationships necessary to transform systems that hold us all back. Narratives about our shared past are powerful in shaping how we think about and understand our present. That is why we are pleased to support the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History in their efforts to illuminate history and create spirited dialogue around the issues that perennially challenge our nation. I'm excited to learn from tonight's program, and I hope you are too. Now it is a great honor to introduce Sharon Pratt, the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History's founding director and the former mayor of our great city, Washington, D.C., as well as Michael Steele, IPPH's senior advisory co-chair, MSNBC co-host of The Weekend, and former Republican National Committee chair. Please help me welcome Mayor Pratt and Chairman Steele.
So, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
My name is Sharon Pratt, and I am the, some people knew, okay, some people knew. I'm the founding, oh, that must be my family, thank you. I'm the founding director of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. We're going to call it IPPH, housed on the campus of the University of the District of Columbia. And all right. And I'm going to tell you more about IPPH in just a moment. But first, I would like to acknowledge, first I want to thank Ford's Theater. Paul Tretog, you and your team are just magnificent. Thank you for your partnership. We are really grateful to you. We're also grateful to W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And they've been a wonderful partner to IPPH. And maybe I should mention here, what is our mission? To rediscover the history of Washington, D.C. That is our mission. And as amazing as it is, we may have Fergus Borderwick with us tonight. He is a great scholar. There's a little scholarship about the capital of the country and this great community. A community with its own vibrant personality. And that is the purpose of IPPH. And so through our programs, we try to help excavate that history. We did it last year with the Founding Fathers. We're doing it this year with the Defining Fathers, individuals, Americans who had much to do with this becoming a major metropolis. Now, I'm going to introduce my co-anchor in just a minute. He's too important for me to do it too soon. But I also want to acknowledge, difficult to know for certain who's all here, but I know that Jack Evans was supposed to be with us tonight, and he's a former member of the council and on the Arts Commission. I know Gretchen Wharton's with us, and she's the vice chair of the Arts Commission. You know, Carol gave me this great list. Myers, who is here, is the executive director of the Arts Commission. And Chappelle, Reginald Chappelle, who's with the National Park Service, is with us. And I also, good, I got something right. And I also want to acknowledge our members of the advisory committee. Also first, UDC Board of Trustees, Dr. Carolyn Rudd and Warner Sessions, but also members of our IPPH Senior Advisory Committee. Almost all of them are working. Mark Thompson, Carol Fulp, and then I'm going to introduce this gentleman last. And another person that I wish to acknowledge tonight, she's an iconic personality. I almost hate to use that expression because people overuse it, but she is the owner of one of the most revered institutions in this city, and that's Virginia Ali with Ben's Chili Bowl.
There she is.
So tonight, we're very honored to be here at Ford's Theater because tonight we're going to talk about our 16th president who had a profound impact on this community, this great nation's capital. But the person who's best suited to talk about that 16th president and to get this show going is none other than the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. Abraham Lincoln was the first president who was a Republican. Yeah. He's also, this gentleman, the co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend. It's a great program. You got to check it out Saturdays and Sundays. And anybody within earshot knows that the reason he became a Republican has everything to do with the profile and the positions and the policies and the personality of the man we speak of tonight, and that's Abraham Lincoln. We are so honored to have with us this evening Michael Steele.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you all very, very much. It is always a special treat for me to do anything and to be a part of anything in my hometown where I grew up in Washington, D.C. Petworth in the house. There we go. Just wanted to get that out. It's a real special treat. It's a very special night. And just a quick acknowledgement again to Ben's Chili Bowl. Thank you for getting me through so many years of crazy. But these are very interesting times for all of us, and it's a reflective moment for me as a member of the Republican Party, and particularly when I consider the party's history and its legacy, to be in this space especially, and to know the sacrifice that one man gave for his country, and to look around at some in my party today who do not recognize that sacrifice. And that's very difficult, which is why conversations like this are very, very important. IPPH has played, I think, an enormously important role in that. And I remember getting a phone call from the mayor, and she was like, I have an idea, and I want you to be a part of it. Okay, so you know how this conversation is going to go, right? It's like, okay, where do I show up? When do I need to be there? And she shared with me this vision, her vision, of what the storytelling of this city should be about. And to house it at such a fine institution as the University of the District of Columbia was another important part of that legacy. And it's really kind of tying our presidents that we started our conversation with last year, and now continuing this year, to not just Washington, but the institutions inside of this great city, and the people, most especially, all of you, some of whom are native Washingtonians, a rare bird indeed, others who've come here, thought they'd be here for 2 years and have been here for 40. And you're now part of this important legacy and this important history. Central to that is something that Lincoln not only discovered about himself and had to rely on, but the country would come to rely on, and that is leadership. And that leadership was important to unify the nation, to level up the conversation on equality at a time when no one wanted to have that conversation, to be an example of integrity in the face of enormous opposition and threats, and to exhibit something that I wish more of our officials, and certainly in my party, would exhibit, and that's moral courage. Moral courage. It all together inspired this man, whose story is a fascinating story of happenstance and opportunity, to speak out against the divisive rhetoric then and today. It gives us that voice to look within ourselves and discover our own moral courage, our own sense of integrity, our own purpose for equality, and our own leadership. That leadership doesn't rest just in the people we elect, but it rests in all of us as citizens, because we've been endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights for sure, but we've been empowered by our Constitution to be the government that will guide this great experiment along the way. And I think Lincoln grew to understand that in a very particular way. So when you step back and examine the moment, you realize that this man's legacy, President Lincoln's legacy, has been written about more than any other president in history. And so tonight we're going to focus on three aspects of his life that have defined not only his presidency, but our country as a nation. And certainly as a young kid growing up in this city, I was inspired by his story and his connection to my community in a very unique way, and understanding and appreciating how difficult it was for him to embrace ultimately the freedom of the black man and the black woman. It's one of the big reasons why I don't refer to myself just as a Republican. I am a Lincoln Republican. And I try to remind people today what that once stood for, because it's important today. So as we go through this evening, we're going to look at Lincoln's unrelenting determination to preserve the Union, how Lincoln defined the war in moral terms, and Lincoln's own evolution on enabling black citizenship. So we're going to begin with the preservation of the Union. President Lincoln was determined to preserve the Union. He was intolerant of those who disrespected the Union. And most importantly, he was intolerant of those who undermined the very principles that girded this country. For an immersion to Lincoln's words, we will experience dramatic reflections this evening from a very accomplished actor, Daniel Hubble. So let us begin.
Sections of Lincoln's first inaugural address, March 4th, 1861. I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Descending from these general principles, we find the proposition that, in legal contemplation, the union is perpetual, confirmed by the history of the Union itself. It follows from these views that no state, upon its own mere motion, can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary, according to circumstances. Section of a message to special session, July 4th, 1861. The assault upon and reduction of Fort Sumter was, in no sense, a matter of self-defense on the part of the assailants. And this issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic or a democracy, a government of the people, can or cannot maintain its own domestic foes. It presents the question whether discontented individuals, too few in numbers to control administration according to organic law, in any case can always, upon pretenses made in this case or any other pretenses, break up their government and thus practically put an end to free government on the earth. It forces us to ask, is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people, or too weak to maintain its own existence? So, viewing this issue, no choice was left but to call out the war power of the government, and so to resist force employed for its destruction by force in its preservation.
The power of those words speaks to Lincoln's unswerving commitment in honoring the very principles upon which our nation was founded. He meant it. He felt it. And he began to understand exactly what this moment meant for not just him as president, but for the country. Mayor, I think in many respects that the Civil War was not just about the end of slavery. We know it clearly didn't begin with that as the focal point.
Right.
That was not what it was all about. But Lincoln incrementally began to decide and to move his administration and his actions in a way that reflected that this great war needed to have a moral purpose to it, that there was something more about this that he felt we needed to focus on as a nation. And that ultimately led to the central purpose becoming ending slavery.
Right. No, absolutely. You know, we put this program together not because of where we are today, but because of Lincoln's profound impact on this suddenly becoming, instead of a backwater venue, a real metropolis, because you had to have a federal presence to prosecute a civil war. And I think what you've just observed, Michael, is so powerful. You know, you don't get to change the rules just because you don't like the outcome of an election. And that's the point that Lincoln made. And he was determined to marshal the resources of the federal government so that they would honor the understanding, the compact that they made when they became a part of the United States of America. You don't change the rules in the middle of the game. So, but you're right. After a point, it sort of had a regional overtone to it. The North thinking industrial, the South thinking a planter system that very much relied upon the enslaved people. Without a doubt, what the element that was percolating beneath all of this was the issue of slavery. And so Lincoln said, this war has got to have a moral mission. It can't just be about a different philosophy on the economy.
Right.
And that's when he started moving in the direction of emancipation.
Section of Abraham Lincoln Letter to Horace Greeley, editor, New York Tribune, August 23rd, 1862. My paramount object on the struggle to save the Union, is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leave others alone, I would also do that. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. By the President of the United States of America, that on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, or any of them, in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. That the executive will, on the first day of the January aforesaid, by proclamation, designate the states and parts of states, if any, in which the people thereof, respectively, shall then be in rebellion against the United States, and the fact that any state or the people thereof shall on that day be, in good faith, represented in the Congress of the United States by members chosen thereto at elections, wherein a majority of the qualified voters of such state shall have participated, shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. Now, therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power vested in me as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, and in accordance with my purpose, so to do publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof, respectively, are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following to wit: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Plaquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James Ascension, Assumption, Terrebonne, La Fourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth, and which accepted parts are for the present left precisely as if this proclamation were not issued. And by the virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that, in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed. Done at the city of Washington, this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, and of the independence of the United States, the 87th. Sections of letter to Albert G. Hodges, editor, Commonwealth Newspaper, Kentucky, on April 4th, 1864. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. And yet, I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. I have not controlled events, but confess plainly that events controlled me.
You think about, and just in a moment, just think about August of 1862 and January of 1863. What happened? What did Lincoln see? What did he come to know that moved him from a position where he confesses well, if we save the Union by keeping slavery, I'll do it. If we save the Union by eliminating slavery, I'll do it. To the point where he would then say, all black men and women enslaved in this Union are now free. That's the moral compass that was locked in on that North Star of freedom. More than likely unrecognizable by Lincoln himself at the time, as expressed in the letter to Albert Hodges, where he says, I have not controlled events, but confess plainly that events controlled me. A man in leadership at a moment in a nation's crisis, leaning into the events around him and fixing his moral compass. Whereupon he says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. These words reflect Lincoln's moral compass. So, Mayor, what do you think were the pragmatic consequences of the emancipation? And how much of Lincoln we see reflected in that, given how probably conflicted he was, even at the moment he's writing this freedom for black men and women?
Well, that was one time being from D.C. helped, because we were a federal territory, so he had the right to do something about it. And so D.C. was the first venue to benefit from emancipation. You know, there's been a lot of back and forth about Abraham Lincoln in this city in the last few years with the liberation of Freedmen's statute, you know. And does that reflect that he was the great emancipator and there was no agency on the part of people, black people, African American people? Of course, we know that it wouldn't have happened without agency on the part of African Americans, as well as others like Garrison and Thaddeus Stevens and others. But I'm with you, Michael. I think he had a moral center. There are people who are pragmatic, and he was pragmatic. He says the Constitution doesn't authorize me to do this, but now that I'm in a war, heck, if I'm going to let you benefit, those of you who are waging war against us, from the asset of enslaved people, I'm going to use that as my license and my excuse to emancipate, contraband, as General Butler said. But he had a moral center. Those were tough decisions. And he understood the difficulty of it. It took him a minute to get there on black equality and citizenship, but he had a moral center. Even when he was in Congress, as you know, one term, he did try to enact legislation that would emancipate African Americans in this city, because he said we certainly should have control in the District of Columbia. They have too much control, you know, I think that, but nonetheless. And so you have to acknowledge that about Abraham Lincoln, I think.
So let's conclude by looking at Lincoln's evolution on the full citizenship for black men and women.
From one of Lincoln's debates with Stephen A. Douglas during the campaign for one of Illinois' 2 United States Senate seats, as reported in Chicago Daily Press on October 15th, 1858. I am not now, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office. I am, as much as any man, in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Message to Congress on signing an act abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C. on April 16, 1862. Fellow citizens of the Senate and House of Representatives, the act entitled An Act for the Release of Certain Persons Held to Service or Labor in the District of Columbia has this day been approved and signed. I have never doubted the constitutional authority of Congress to abolish slavery in this district, and I have ever desired to see the national capital freed from the institution in some satisfactory way. Hence, there has never been, in my mind, any question upon the subject except the one of expediency, arising in view of all the circumstances. If there be matters within and about this act which might have taken a course or shape more satisfactory to my judgment, I do not attempt to specify them. I am gratified that the two principles of compensation and colonization are both recognized and practically applied in the Act. In the matter of compensation, it is provided that claims may be presented within 90 days from the passage of the Act, but not thereafter, and there is no saving for minors, femmes cauvaires, insane, or absent persons. I presume this is an omission by mere oversight, and I recommend that it be supplied by an amendatory or supplemental act. Second inaugural address. Washington, D.C., March 4th, 1865. Fellow countrymen, at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than was first. Then a statement, somewhat in detail, of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All know that this interest was, somehow, the cause of the war, to strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected the war, the magnitude, or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or ever before, the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we may be judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That far, neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offenses cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that which he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from the divine attributes which the believer in a living God always ascribed to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God will that it continues until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen, 250 years of unrequited toil, shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago. So still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Sections from Lincoln's last speech, April 11th, 1865. We meet this evening, not in sorrow, but in gladness of heart. The evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond and the surrender of the principal insurgent army give hope of a righteous and speedy peace whose joyous expression cannot be restrained. In the midst of this, however, he from whom all blessings flow must not be forgotten. A call for a national thanksgiving is being prepared and will be duly promulgated. Nor must those whose harder part gives us the cause for rejoicing be overlooked. Their honors must not be parceled out with others. I myself was near the front and had the high pleasure of transmitting much of the good news to you. But no part of the honor for plans or execution is mine. To General Grant, his skillful officers, and brave men all belongs. The gallant Navy stood ready, but was not in reach to take active part. As a general rule, I abstain from reading reports of attacks upon myself, wishing not to be provoked by that to which I cannot properly offer an answer. In spite of this precaution, however, it comes to my knowledge that I am much censured for supposed agency in setting up and seeking to sustain the new state of Louisiana. In this I have done just so much and no more than the public knows. We all agree that the seceded states, so called, are out of their proper relation with the Union, and that the sole object of the government, civil and military, in regard to those states, is to again get them into their proper practical relation. The amount of constituency, so to speak, on which the new Louisiana government rests would be satisfactory to all if it contained 50, 30, or even 20,000 instead of only about 12,000, as it does. It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. The Gettysburg Address. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, November 19th, 1865. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do so. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel Hubble. He did a great job and gave us a sense of our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. Thank you very much. And I hope that you observed, in terms of the reflections, in terms of the public remarks of Abraham Lincoln, they were sequenced as they were because Gettysburg Address, he was probably the president more than even Thomas Jefferson that made the Declaration of Independence, the principles of it, front and center for the United States more than even the Constitution. But secondly, it was when he made those remarks after Appomattox on the 11th of April from the White House that's when John Wilkes Booth and his co-conspirators said, no, we're not going to kidnap him. That's what they'd been thinking about. No, we're going to kill him. Because what did he say? That black men should have the right to vote. And that's when John Wilkes Booth said, that'll be his last speech. That's what he said. And it was. So we now are going to talk to those who are true Lincoln historians, who will give us even deeper insight into this regarding this 16th president who has become almost a semi-deity in American history. And I'll turn that over to you, Michael.
No, absolutely. We're very excited to welcome our historians to the stage. Before we do, I want to encourage our audience to use the Slido QR code on the flyer to input questions to be asked of our distinguished panelists during the Q&A period. So we would like to get your questions so that I can read them here. So technology, right? This is how it works. So let's welcome Dr. Christopher Bonner and Dr. Michael Burlingame to the stage. Dr. Christopher Bonner is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park. He specializes in African American history and the 19th century United States. His book, Remaking the Republic, Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, centers free blacks in the legal transformation of the United States during the mid-19th century. He also has provided commentary for Lincoln's Dilemma, a 4-part documentary series offering a fresh exploration of President Lincoln and the complex journey to end slavery. He received his BA from Howard University and PhD from Yale University. Dr. Burlingame holds the Chancellor Naomi Lynn Distinguished Chair at Lincoln Studies, University of Illinois, Springfield. He has written and edited 20 books on Lincoln. Among them, Abraham Lincoln, A Life, a 2,000-page award-winning biography. 2,000 pages?
Right.
Dude, okay.
It's a good book. Be sure to buy it. You don't have to read it, but be sure to buy it, all right?
2,000 pages. Okay, most recent books include An American Marriage, The Untold Story of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd, and The Black Man's President, Abraham Lincoln, African Americans, and the Pursuit of Racial Equality. He is a graduate of Princeton and Johns Hopkins, all right, alumni there, of Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, I guess we'll begin with you, Dr. Bonner. Abraham Lincoln, as we know, was always felt slavery was immoral. You are agreeing?
I'm listening actively.
Okey-dokey. But he had a bit of a distance to go,
Right.
as regards certainly the notion of equality and citizenship. Could you give us a sense of that journey? And do you think, as you know, I suggested that he did have a moral center, especially living in America, but what is your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, so first, thank you for the question. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. I think when we think about questions of citizenship, citizenship is ultimately about belonging. It's about legal belonging, about social belonging. And so when I think about Lincoln's evolution, I think you've highlighted here in the opening presentation a couple of key landmarks. You know, I think 1862 is a major landmark. Lincoln invites into the White House 5 black ministers and essentially encourages them to encourage other African Americans to leave the country. Lincoln's promoting, he's endorsing this policy of colonization, the idea that black folks should be removed either to West Africa, to Latin America, to the Caribbean. And so that's a thing that is upsetting to a lot of African Americans that Douglas and others are very critical of. I think that we should recognize as a part of Lincoln's politics. But then in 1865, as we heard in some of his last remarks, he is saying that black soldiers should be allowed to have the right to vote. And so that's a real endorsement of black political belonging. So we can't understand Lincoln without recognizing the dramatic nature of that change, right? To go from a person saying black folks should leave the country, or at the very least wondering whether black folks have a place in the country, to a president, a person who is saying black folks should not only live here, but be a part of the political community. It's a remarkable evolution. At the same time, I think it's important that we recognize that the evolution was incomplete. Lincoln says black soldiers should have the right to vote. Thousands and thousands of white men for decades had been voting without having served in the military. And so I don't necessarily see it as an evolution to a point of embracing black equality. It's an evolution to a point of accepting black belonging on some sort of qualified terms. And really, part of the tragedy of Lincoln's story is that his evolution remained incomplete because his life was cut short. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about that evolution.
If I could, just to go back to the point of Lincoln's evolution on equality, you're saying he didn't quite get there, despite some of the outward signs of what he did, the Emancipation Proclamation, wanting African American men to vote. He still had sort of a box that he couldn't check.
Yeah, well, I think I think it's important to draw a distinction between freedom and equality.
Okay.
Lincoln did incredible work. No one can dispute that Lincoln did incredible work to promote black freedom. But freedom was one part of a process of making racial justice, of making racial equality. You know, saying that all men should have the right to vote on the same terms. That would have been a call for equality, and that's something that's different from what Lincoln said. And different from what Lincoln did in the Emancipation Proclamation.
And certainly different from what we saw through from Reconstruction onward into Jim Crow, how that incompleteness was played out. So, Dr. Burlingame, you've got this very complex man who himself is in many ways conflicted about this issue of slavery, and is trying to find all these different solutions, inviting African Americans to the White House. Say, okay, why don't y'all just get on a boat and go, and just go. Not necessarily wanting to confront the very hard truth in front of him that he would have to eventually get to. Tell us a little bit about this complex man. I mean, what was it in him, given his humble beginnings and his educational track, his, sort of happenstance nature of how he wound up in Congress and eventually becoming president, founding a party, being part of founding a political party. What was it about him that made him tick in that we may not understand or appreciate given what we know about him today?
Well, that's a big question. I'll try to save you 1,600 pages of reading and 400 pages of footnotes by first suggesting that the meeting that Lincoln had with 5 black leaders of the Washington community on August 14, 1862, is widely misunderstood. And the best interpretation we have of what Lincoln was up to on August 14, 1862, was written the following month by a leading black minister here in Washington. He was the head of the Israel African American Episcopal Church here on Capitol Hill, well, on Capitol Hill down the street. And his name was Henry McNeil Turner. And he was a regular correspondent for one of the leading black newspapers at the time, the Christian Recorder, was published in Philadelphia. And he writes an elaborate response to the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln announced on September 22nd, so just a few weeks after the meeting with the 5 black leaders. And he said, the notion that Lincoln was an enthusiast for a black resettlement abroad is grossly exaggerated. He's no stickler for that. What he was really getting at in this address, which, by the way, was very unusual because he invited a shorthand reporter to come in. It's the only time we know that he did that, to take down every word that he said to be published in the press throughout the country. And so what Henry McNeil Turner says is what the president was trying to do was to convince white people who he knew were going to be very upset about the Emancipation Proclamation, which he was about to issue. So he had written the Emancipation Proclamation and told his cabinet in July that he was going to issue it. And his Secretary of State wisely said, the timing is terrible. We've just suffered a major defeat in our campaign against Richmond. And if on the heels of that humiliating, ignominious defeat, we issue an Emancipation Proclamation, it's going to seem like a desperate measure and will be regarded as insincere. So let's wait till we have a victory and issue it on the heels of that victory. And Lincoln says, I hadn't thought of that. It's a good point. So what happens between July, when he tells the cabinet that he's written the Emancipation Proclamation, and he doesn't want them to, you can make minor suggestions about it, but I'm going to do this, no matter what you say. And September, Lincoln is thinking, what can I do to minimize the white backlash that I know is going to be generated by this Emancipation Proclamation, particularly in the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and in southern Illinois, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Pennsylvania, which are filled with people who have many of whom came from the South and have no sympathy for the anti-slavery movement. So Lincoln has been told by any number of people in the border slave states, including some of his best friends, look, people down here are not going to accept emancipation unless you couple it with colonization. And so what he was doing was not really speaking to those 5 gentlemen. He was speaking to the nation, particularly to the border slave states and to the lower north. That my administration is serious about colonization. That you don't have to worry that there is going to be this great tsunami of free slaves coming swarming across the Mason-Dixon line and across the Ohio River. That we are going to, as a government, make it possible for black people to resettle abroad if they want to. This is strictly voluntary. And Lincoln also believed that there were a number of black people, like John Russwurm, the founder of the graduate of Bowdoin College and the founder of the first black newspaper, who said, I'm moving to Liberia. Forget about any chance black people are ever going to have in the United States to get anything like first-class citizenship. And what I think was on Lincoln's mind is that people who felt that way deserved some haven, some refuge where they could enjoy first-class citizenship. He didn't, and Henry McNeill Turner says he doesn't believe that large numbers of black people are going to leave the country. That he knows that. But he does believe that there should be a place where people can go if they are pessimistic about the prospects of enjoying first-class citizenship. And we owe it as a government to them to provide them with that kind of refuge. And so, and about citizenship, when Lincoln gives that speech on April 11th, 1865, which, as you quite rightly point out, and this is something that people don't fully appreciate.
Yeah,
that man who was sitting up there got killed not because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation or because he supported the 13th Amendment. He was murdered because he called for black voting rights. And John Wilkes Booth turns to his compatriots and says, that means N-word citizenship, by God, that's the last speech he's ever going to give, by God, I'm going to run him through. And 3 days later, he killed him. And therefore, I think it's appropriate for us in the 21st century to think of Lincoln as much of a martyr to black rights as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or Viola Liuzzo or James Reeb or Mickey Schwerner or James Chaney or all those people who got killed back in the 1960s as they championed the civil rights revolution of that time.
Well, let me follow up, if I may.
Sure.
And it's sort of a tough question, but let me begin with, I have no doubt that he had a moral center, and I have no doubt that he truly believed that slavery itself was immoral. But we do live in America, and there is a racial caste system in America, and it's very tough, be you white or black, frankly, whatever you are, not to be impacted by it. So how does this man, who was born into such abject poverty, not that poverty does it in and of itself, he had limited access to books, you know, he manages to evolve to this human being that could transcend this, who could have a vision with such muscle to it. Was it just organic, or was it the influence of people like Frederick Douglass or Thaddeus Stevens or William Garrison? What were the influences that got him to that?
Well, I think when Lincoln says in the Hodges letter, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. The evidence is there that that's the case. When he's a young legislator, he sticks his neck out when almost every legislator in the Illinois General Assembly said, we're going to condemn the abolitionist movement. 94 of them said that we condemn the abolitionist movement, and 6 of them, including Lincoln, said, no, we disagree. And then 2 of those guys, including Lincoln, go a step further and say, we believe that slavery is based on injustice and bad policy. And for somebody in Springfield, Illinois, who was ambitious politically to stick his neck out that way, whoa. And then Lincoln says in 1860, my position on slavery was enunciated in 1837, and I've felt that way ever since. So I think he hated and loathed and despised slavery from early on. And my interpretation of that is partly he had an extremely sensitive conscience. And it's hard to say why some people have a very sensitive conscience and some people
don't have any.
Right. Now, so when Lincoln was growing up, for example, on the frontier, it was considered great sport among the young boys to torture animals, to take a turtle and break its shell and put a hot coal on its back, or to throw a snake into the fire and watch it wiggle. And Lincoln condemned that and scolded his playmates. And where does that come from? And I think anybody who had that kind of moral sensibility would find the enslavement of people to be outrageous. And a second reason why I think Lincoln hated and loathed and despised slavery from very early on is because his father treated him like a slave. It's one of the interesting things about Lincoln's anti-slavery pronouncements is he doesn't emphasize many of the issues that other anti-slavery leaders did. He doesn't talk about the breakup of slave families. He doesn't talk about the physical brutality of slavery. He doesn't talk about the slaveholders' suppression of civil liberties. He doesn't talk about the creation of a quasi-aristocratic social order in the South based on slavery. Instead, as in the second inaugural, he says it's an outrage that the slaveholders have rewritten the word of God Almighty himself, who said, in the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat thy bread, to read, in the sweat of somebody else's brow shalt thou eat thy bread. And so his sense of justice was offended by that, partly because his father would keep yanking him out of school and renting him out to neighbors. And every penny that Lincoln made doing backbreaking farm labor that he was rented out was turned over to his father, because the rule of custom and law in those days was not that parents didn't own children, they couldn't sell them, but the labor, any potential earning capacity that a child had, and any money that was made had to be turned over to the father. And Lincoln's father was pretty insistent on that. Now, I believe that it was one of the reasons that he identified with the slaves, and he identified his father with the slaveholders. Now, a lot of my friends, I am something of a psychohistorian. That's one word, by the way. There are psychohistorians, 2 words, but I fancy that I do not belong to that category. What can I tell you? So I think most historians are from Missouri. They say, show me, what's your evidence? And the problem is with something like that, when you argue about unconscious motivation, it's very hard to prove it with a kind of documentation that historians like Dear Diary. Today I decided to denounce slavery because my father treated me like a slave.
You've done a lot of research on Lincoln, and so you are at liberty to have an intuitive sense of it. But let me ask Dr. Bonner this, if I may, as well.
Sure.
You know, when we talk about Abraham Lincoln, especially here in Washington, D.C., we often give a lot of credit to our great sage from Cedar Hill, Frederick Douglass. But there were also other thought leaders here who had an influence. Do you think they are inappropriately overlooked in terms of their impact on Lincoln?
Yeah, you know, I think that there's a way in which any sort of approach to trying to make sense of a major change or a major choice that a person makes, that people might be drawn to one figure or one sort of impetus, right? Frederick Douglass changed Abraham Lincoln, right? And you know, Michael's written about the ways that Lincoln was talking with other black folks. Henry Highland Garnett, Sojourner Truth, Martin Delany. So like we know that Lincoln was talking with and thinking in response to, at least, maybe not thinking alongside, but thinking in response to a lot of other prominent African Americans. One of the ways that I've been thinking about influences on Lincoln, though, is a sort of broader African American political community. So when I think about some of the problems that black soldiers faced, one of the major issues that they were dealing with in 1863 and 64 was unequal pay. And soldiers from famous regiments like the 54th, they were petitioning Lincoln and saying, we're doing a soldier's duty. We should deserve a soldier's pay. Like our blood is in the field. We should be treated like any other soldier, but they were paid unequally to white soldiers. And so they are writing to Lincoln and saying, pay us equally. But what they're really saying is, and again, this is 63 and 64, they're saying, we deserve equality, not just we deserve freedom. And so I think of them as part of this wider African-American political community, beyond the people whose names we can call and whose papers we can dig into, people like Delaney and Douglas. They were part of this black political community that was driving Lincoln toward that moment in 1865 when he does embrace this partial version of black equality.
Dr. Burlingame, let's sort of, I guess, level up the conversation around probably the most prominent influencer, Frederick Douglass, which Dr. Bonner just mentioned. What was that influence that Frederick Douglass had? Was there respect mutual, one way? How did Douglass impact Lincoln? And in what degree did Lincoln impact Douglass?
Well, as a preliminary response, I'd like to say that Lincoln is sometimes thought to have been educated here in Washington about racial justice. That out in Illinois, he didn't know people like Frederick Douglass and Martin Delaney and Sojourner Truth and people like that, whom he met in Washington and spoke with, who we invited to the White House. But in fact, Lincoln, living in a racially mixed neighborhood, knew about friends of his down the road who were black people who worked in the Underground Railroad. He had clients who were black people. He had friends who were black people, had servants who were black people. And these were not just menials, these were people who were real friends. And one of the most remarkable men that he knew in Springfield was a gentleman named Florville. And Robert Florville was a remarkable guy. He was a barber, but he was also a very successful real estate speculator and entrepreneur. He spoke multiple languages. He played many musical instruments. Lincoln loved to hang out with him. And when Willie dies, when Lincoln's son Willie dies in the White House in February '62, we have this letter from Florville. And Florville says, and you can tell by the letter, it's a long letter and it's very warm. You can tell the feeling tone is very, it's not a servant talking to an employer or a client talking to a lawyer. It's a real friend, and he's talking about how much he admired Willie and how much he thought he was so much more advanced than other boys of his age. And then he talks about it, Lincoln's dog, your dog is being taken well care of, and your house too, because the people who rented it don't have children to ruin it. And so I think Lincoln comes, the old notion was, and this Benjamin Quarles, great black historian, made this argument that Lincoln didn't really know any black people out in Springfield. There were any account that he never would come to regard black people as particularly competent or self-assertive or all that. And he knew people, like people who were in the Underground Railroad, people who were insisting that black people have schools. These were guys that he would meet. And he lived in this racially integrated neighborhood. And when he walked to his office, he would pass by black people. And all of those that we know about that interacted with him had the most, said he was an instinctive racial egalitarian. He just didn't have a racist bone in his body.
So, go ahead.
But I want to get to, how did the Frederick Douglass piece, though?
Okay.
So what was that relationship, and how did they influence each other's thinking about this issue as well as others?
Well, Frederick Douglass offered an explanation. He said that he thought that Lincoln was the only white man that he knew who didn't make him feel self-conscious about his race. And that one of the reasons that he had that kind of instinctive egalitarian sentiment, particularly in relationship to Douglass, is that they both started from the bottom. That Lincoln grew up, everybody on the frontier lived in what we would consider today poverty. The Lincoln family lived in poverty by the standards of the frontier. And that he raised himself so high through his hard work, his commitment to reading and hard work that he identified, that they both rose up from the bottom rung to the top, and they respected one another. And so I think Frederick Douglass clearly intensified Lincoln's instinctive racial egalitarianism. And then about Frederick Douglass's attitude toward Lincoln, and you alluded to the controversy about the Emancipation Memorial over on Capitol Hill, the 1876, when Frederick Douglass gave a speech in which he said Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, and we black people were only his stepchildren. Well, imagine my surprise when I'm doing my Lincoln research at the Library of Congress, this was many years ago. I'm going through the Frederick Douglass papers. And in his handwriting, I see this speech, June 1st, 1865. It says, Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. I said, good Lord. And this was an important speech. It was given as a eulogy to Lincoln on June 1st, 1865 in Cooper Union, arguably the most prominent space in the country to give a public address. And it was covered by the New York press. And that phrase, emphatically the black man's president, shows up in the New York press. And so I thought, my goodness, how could I have missed this speech of Frederick Douglass's? Because Yale Press had published 5 or 6 volumes of very fat volumes. My volumes are magisterial. Those are fat. Right? I said, I couldn't believe that I missed it. So I went to the 1865, June 1st, and it wasn't there. And so I wrote to the people at Yale, no offense, and said,
Nothing to do with that.
and said, how was it that you didn't include this remarkable speech? No response. I called and left a voicemail message. No response. Well, those of us who went to Princeton aren't surprised that Yale would conduct itself in this fashion. I thought, well, what can I tell you? And so the question is, why would Frederick Douglass in 1865 say Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president, and then 11 years later say he was the white man's president? And I think the answer is this, that in 1876, when he spoke at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial, he had a big black audience, lots of black, because that statue was created by money that blacks had contributed, solely by money that blacks had contributed. At that point, he also had the power elite of the country as part of his audience. He had the president, the vice president, cabinet members, congressional leaders, Supreme Court justices, and so on. And so what he was doing on that occasion, it seems to me, what he was doing was saying, do not let Reconstruction go down the drain. That in the aftermath of the Civil War, the 14th and 15th Amendments get passed, an attempt to guarantee black civil rights and then voting rights. And they were enforced for a while, rigorously by President Grant. But then by the mid-1870s, by 1876, public interest seemed to be waning in racial justice. But a real depression had begun in 1873, and that public opinion in the North seemed to be absorbed with matters of restoration of prosperity and financial issues and greenback issues and the like. And Frederick Douglass was saying, I think this is the subtext of his speech, and my interpretation is, you guys don't let Reconstruction go down the drain. And don't think of Reconstruction and the attempt to endow black people with voting rights and civil rights is some kind of bleeding heart liberal gesture by some sentimental guy.
He sort of capitalized on the occasion.
He was a tough-minded guy who had the interest of your race at heart, and he knew that it was in the interest of the white race to have black people enjoy equal citizenship.
Can I
Yeah, go ahead,
so
Dr.
I think
Fine.
that part of what I think we're getting at is Lincoln's complexity, right? So as Douglass says in 1876, Lincoln was the white man's president, and that's sort of like this warning, as you're saying, Michael, don't let policy be dictated by the needs only of white people. But what Douglass also says is under his rule, black folks were enlisted into the military. Under his rule, they were provided with legal avenue toward freedom. So I think Douglass is recognizing Lincoln's complexity, and I think it's important for us to recognize that complexity as well, even as we see I would never get up here and say Lincoln seems like a pretty good guy, right? He seemed like he had friends of all races, like he was not generally a jerk. Like I think that's a good way to describe him, but I also think that it's important to keep in mind the particular policies he was enacting, and that for much of the early Civil War, as Douglas saw him, he was a white man's president. And he became, as the war progressed, as he moved toward emancipation, he became a black man's president, a president under whose rule all of these changes could be implemented.
Right, and you know, it's still a complicated issue in
Yeah,
America.
exactly, right, yeah.
So let me ask you though, I want to ask, because I know you did write about Mary Todd Lincoln, but I'd like both of your thoughts. She's gotten a sort of quite a mixed reviews as the First Lady. Well, the thing that I found interesting for this, just as a preamble for this series, as we talk about the three Americans who had such an influence on the city of the suddenly becoming a meaningful metropolis, all of it around the Civil War, such a contrast to the ones who insisted that the city or the capital be in the South, which were three planters, privileged men, Washington, Jefferson, Madison. Amazingly, in this period of this such a crisis period, the three who suddenly emerge are the full expression of the American dream. They come from abject poverty. I mean, it's, Grant probably was better off than any of them, and he was, had a hard scrabble beginning. Of course, Frederick Douglass, I mean, worse than that, he was enslaved. He was hoping to find food, you know, just to exist. And then Abraham Lincoln, who apparently lived in a cabin where there was no floor or window until his father remarried. So, I mean, it was, and yet all three of them marry women above their station. That is, Grant marries Julia Dent Grant, who was a privileged woman. Her family were enslavers. Douglas marries a free black woman, Anna Douglas, and then Lincoln marries Mary Todd Lincoln. My point simply is that Mary Todd Lincoln had the option to marry Stephen Douglas, as I gather. That he,
Well, that's...
you question that?
Well, Douglas finally, she said, well, it wasn't really very serious.
But she was still arguably
after.
a woman of some circumstance. I know there's a back and forth, but let's just, she saw in him the potential to be an extraordinary person. Having that kind of affirmation, do you not think that that was an asset, or do you think, people have said she was bipolar, she had a lot of issues, that she was a liability? What is your opinion of Mary Todd Lincoln?
Well, in many ways, she was a liability. Lincoln very seldom let down his hair about his personal life and his marriage. But in a document that I discovered, I couldn't believe this hadn't been part of the historical record, but the first day I went out to do original research on unpublished sources, I wrote my first book called The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln. It's a series of psychological essays about his relations with his wife and his children and his parents and his depression and his midlife crisis, all that sort of thing. I wanted to call it Shrinking Lincoln. But my stuffy old publisher, the University of Illinois Press, wouldn't go along with that. And so I drafted it based on published sources. I was teaching at a Connecticut College in New London, so I said, all right, I know that I've got the published literature, I've got pretty well under control. Now it's time to go out and do some manuscript research. And I go to Brown, and the first day I'm at Brown, which if you can't be here in Washington doing research or in Springfield on Lincoln, Providence is still the best place to go, at Brown University. Because John Hay was Lincoln's assistant personal secretary, and all kinds of materials that he generated. Anyway, it's a good place to do it. So I go, and the first day I'm there, I discover this essay, this reminiscence by one of Lincoln's closest friends, Orville Browning, who was a lawyer and a Whig activist and a Republican activist in Illinois, and who knew Lincoln very well. And when Lincoln's son dies, he asks Browning to go and take care of the funeral arrangements. They're very close friends, politically and socially. And they'd been in the legislature together, and he was particularly fond of Browning and Mrs. Browning. And Browning writes and tells Nicolay, Lincoln's principal White House secretary, that Lincoln told me several times in the White House that he was terrified that his wife would do something to humiliate him publicly. And I said, well, where's this evidence been? And I asked the people at Brown, and they said, well, we've cataloged it, we made it available, but nobody's seen it. And I published those interviews. The fact is she did humiliate him, because she wanted people appointed to office, like Commissioner of Public Buildings in Washington, which was a very important position for the city of Washington, the Commissioner of Public Buildings in those days, who was a scoundrel, who said, you know, I'll give you a diamond bracelet or a necklace if you'll get me that job. And you think, what? So there are all kinds of episodes like that where she engages in promoting rascals to positions in the federal bureaucracy.
But do you think he would have seen that he had the capacity to go after the presidency on his own? Do you think that she was irrelevant to that pursuit?
No, I think he was ambitious to begin with.
Yes.
She didn't create his ambition.
I didn't say she did.
Right, and I didn't mean to imply it. But what I will say is that she turbocharged it.
Yeah.
And he might have been happy to be a senator or something, but to be president, she really wanted to be first lady, and so she was. And Lincoln's favorite play was Macbeth, and the main reason because of fatalism. And Lincoln was a great fatalist, and there's no better literary representation of fatalism than Macbeth. But also, secondarily, it's a play about a husband and wife. A loveless marriage in which the wife is more ambitious than the husband. And so I think that resonated with him.
And Dr. Bonner, what do you think of Mary Todd?
So, frankly, I can't speak to Mary Todd and the relationship, but I can maybe, as a preview to the Douglas event, right? I think in a very literal way, we would not have a Frederick Douglass as we know him without Anna Murray Douglass. And this is, you know, Anna Murray saved the money to buy a train ticket for Frederick to escape from Baltimore. She borrowed clothing and freedom papers for Douglass to use as a ruse on his train trip. And then beyond that, once they made it to the North into freedom, Anna Douglass at that point stayed home with their 4 children and raised them while Douglass was taking the train back and forth across the North to become a famous abolitionist and to travel to the UK to enact that sort of anti-slavery political life. So I think it's critical to think about the various material ways in which a woman like Anna made Frederick Douglass.
And I could, if I could add a footnote to my earlier observation about the role that Mrs. Lincoln played in Lincoln's life, I think she helped not only to turbocharge his ambition, that's important, but she also contributed to his political career by making his home life so miserable. And this is what his friends said, that he was the only lawyer. All the lawyers in Springfield couldn't make enough money just practicing law in Springfield in those days. So every spring and every fall, they would go out on the circuit. And they would go from one county seat to the next, and practice for a day or two, and then maybe a week or two, and it varied. But all the attorneys would go out, but none of them would go on the whole circuit, except Lincoln and one other. That is to say, at every single. And he was the only one who didn't go home on weekends. And they all knew and then said that his home life was so disagreeable, that she was gave him such a hard time. She struck him, she attacked him physically, she ridiculed him in front of other people, and she chased him out of the house with a knife, chased him out of the house, throwing things at him. And then we have testimony from neighbors, because in those days, you didn't have air conditioning, like you had the windows open, and the houses were close together, so you sort of knew what was going on next door and down the block. And so it was assumed and as a result, he did a lot of what we would call networking. That is, when he was out on the circuit, it wasn't just practicing law, but it was also politicking and chatting with people and getting to know the jurors and the judges and all that. And also, one of the things that made Lincoln such a successful president was his remarkable ability to take nothing personally, to not get upset by insults, by Charles Sumner, Horace Greeley, George McClellan, when you think of the very difficult people that Lincoln had to deal with and how he kept his temper. And one of my favorite Lincoln documents is a letter he wrote to a young captain who was squabbling with his superior officer. And Lincoln said, the advice of a father to a son, then quoting Polonius and Hamlet, saying, beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. And Lincoln said, that's great advice, except it's not the best. Quarrel not at all. No man determined to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self-control. Yield greater things to which you can show no more than an equal claim, and lesser things, though clearly your own.
Well,
and then he says, that's enough.
I was going to say, would modern day Republican presidents understand that principle? So Dr. Bonner, I want to, in that context of the modern day party, the modern day political climate, you look at someone like Lincoln and everything that he had to deal with, keeping in mind that, you know, the Republican Party, when he assumes the presidency, is 6 years old. The country is entering into conflict, but then there are all these other things that are going on as well. You still have to run the country despite the war. You still have entanglements and engagements abroad. What lessons should we learn from Lincoln today?
I don't know, I'm stuck on this idea of like quarrel not at all. It's like, maybe that's nice advice, but there's no way that Lincoln as president didn't quarrel, right? Like, so much of his job is arguing in pursuit of the things that he wanted,
But it's
right?
not impugning people's motives or their character or the like. And so
right.
I think
He
if
didn't
you disagree,
personalize it.
it's
Yeah, I
to
think we
disagree is
shouldn't think
okay, but to quarrel, to,
It wasn't all about him.
engage in ad hominem attacks.
Well, yeah, so this is something that I would think we should take. So I think of like arguing as an important aspect of what Lincoln did. He argued eventually for emancipation. He argued for black enlistment. He argued for rights for black soldiers. What I think is really fascinating about Lincoln, I think it's easy to be drawn to him as a leader, as like this is what a president should be like, or this is what a leader should be like. But I think that when I think about what Lincoln did to promote these various causes, I see him as a collaborator, as a person who was working alongside a lot of other people. The policy of emancipation came from Lincoln listening to Congress and listening to what black folks were demanding, right? So Lincoln was not leading the move toward. Lincoln was not leading, I will stand by that argument, the move toward the ending of slavery. Lincoln was following the actions of thousands and thousands of other Americans, black and white, right? So Lincoln listened when he needed to, and he was flexible. He was dynamic in his thought, and he was willing to hear from other folks, even folks who were quarreling, and take information and ideas and then sort of implement these policies that were really
Was that the sort of
valuable? Right?
Yeah,
right.
but you strike an interesting point there, because it really is what Joyce Kearns Goodwin sort of wrote about in her book, which is a great book, Team of Rivals.
Yeah.
Was all that arguing and all that quarreling that members of his cabinet engaged in. He, you know, may or may not have done it.
He heard dueling perspectives, right? Sure. I think about that, but that's a way of thinking about Lincoln as listening to people who were essentially his peers or close to his peers. But again, if I could tell the story of emancipation, when I talk with my students, I almost kind of tell it backwards. So the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 so as Lincoln's drafting it and issuing the preliminary proclamation, he's explicitly saying that what he's doing is enforcing the laws that Congress have implemented. And Congress has implemented this confiscation policy in 1861 and 62 that says the military cannot be used to return fugitive slaves. Congress implements that confiscation policy, building on the contraband policy that was implemented in the camps by people like Benjamin Butler in the spring of 1861. And Butler is doing that because black folks are running to the military camps and banging on the doors and saying, let me in, I can help, and keep me out of the hands of my owner. So all of that, all of that action, starting with those dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of slaves running to the camps, those are the voices that Lincoln is hearing and engaging with when he implements the emancipation policy. So that's why, he's listening far beyond. He's hearing people far beyond Seward and others in the cabinet. So I think that that's invaluable.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if I could follow up on that, I hear what you're saying, and obviously you're a real scholar in it. I'm certainly not going to disagree. And, so much of my life has been in politics, and what I know is that those who survive it know that they have to build a constituency if they're going to do something. As they say, a leader without a following is just a man out taking a walk. And and so what he seems to be is the ultimate pragmatist who at least has some moral center. I hear what you're saying. If it hadn't been for all of these individuals pushing and prodding, he never would have gotten there. So back to the question that Michael Steele is asking, though, and I ask both of you, what can we learn from Lincoln, and how would you rank him in the pantheon of presidents?
I don't want to touch the question of ranking. That's just not how I think about history. I suspect 2,000 pages would mean he's number one. But I think that we should learn from Lincoln that people in power should listen, and that good things happen when people in power listen to those who have less of it.
Well, I share Chris's reluctance to engage in the ranking business. But what I tell my students is there is a prevailing view in the historical profession that historical change, it doesn't depend on one man or one person, one woman. It's the product of vast impersonal economic forces, demographic forces, what have you. And I tell my students, a lot of that is true. But there are occasions when one person can make a big difference.
Yeah. And
I think in the history of this country, the two people who are most apt to be described that way, and justifiably described that way, are George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. It's very hard to imagine that the country could have moved from the Articles of Confederation, where we were sort of like the UN, not a real government, but a debating society, to a real powerful central government that has made a huge difference. And that the willingness of the American people at the polls, voting in each state, do we approve this Constitution or not? For those people to say, okay, even though we have just revolted against a strong central government, but we're willing to give this a shot because the Constitution was written at a convention which was presided over by George Washington, and everybody knew that Washington would be the first president. I don't think that the Constitution could have been written and adopted without that kind of trust that people had in the judgment and character of George Washington. And similarly, it's very hard for me to see, and I admit my bias, that there's any president who could have led the North to victory in the Civil War between Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt, who could have done it. When you think of all the other media, Martin Van Buren's and the Benjamin Harrisons and the like, it's hard to imagine.
So we've got a little bit of time left, and we want to, because we have a lot of questions. Thank y'all very much for the questions. So we've got some questions for our esteemed panel, and we'll start with this one. Frederick Douglass counseled the president. When did it start in his moral compass? When did he start in his moral compass to accept that counsel, what that counsel offered him?
So this is a thing that I'm actually really interested in, and I don't know. There might be a simple answer to this. Like, to what extent was Lincoln reading Douglass? Reading him actually? Like, so when they meet, I think that Lincoln says something like, I've read about you, or I know you, but I think he means it in like the sort of broader sense, not personally. So I don't know, and part why I'm curious about this is because in 61 and 62, Douglass is super disappointed in Lincoln's hesitancy to embrace black emancipation and to make the war what Douglass sees as obvious. It's a war against slave owners, and therefore it must be a war against slavery, right? So Douglass is writing some very angry things about Lincoln in Douglass's Monthly. But then when they meet, and across the sort of conversations that they have, especially in I think, after Lincoln's second inauguration, Lincoln says something like, what did you think about the speech? Like, I value your opinion more than any other. And so I don't know if or when Lincoln was actually reading Douglass, but the fact that by 63 they're meeting, and 64 Lincoln's proposing this emancipation plot and asking Douglass to take part, and then 65 he's saying that, I think that Lincoln cared deeply about what Douglass thought. He thought that Douglass was a valuable critic. And to me, that suggests that he must have known some of the things that Douglass was writing in the earlier stages of the war.
And then Douglass, likewise, over that period, began to see Lincoln differently than he did in 61 and 62.
I think that Douglass, you know, as Michael said, Douglass is playing politics, right? So when Douglass is writing really angry things about Lincoln, it's not necessarily because he thinks Lincoln is a bad guy, right? He's pushing. He's pushing. He's leaning on the president and saying, essentially, you're the white man's president. Is that who you want to be known as, right? Is that how you want to be seen? And trying to sort of make that, use rhetoric to his advantage in that way.
So Michael, to that point, some historians, question here, or writers have researched President Lincoln, have claimed that he didn't willingly end slavery, but in fact, that was never his plan.
He hated and loathed and despised slavery from the time he was young. If he had done what he wanted to do, he would have issued the Emancipation Proclamation on March 4th, 1861. But he couldn't. As he says in the Hodges letter, I didn't think that the office of the presidency endowed me to take measures which were simply in accordance with my own values and moral concerns. I was limited by the Constitution. And so one of the things apropos of that I would like to emphasize, apropos of your observation, Chris, about Lincoln saying black soldiers should have the vote. That's not what he said. He said that those who served in the military and those who were very intelligent, by which we should, which I'm sure
That's a modifier,
which he meant literate.
Yeah.
And he knew plenty of literate black people. And particularly two gentlemen from New Orleans who come and say, we have a petition of 1,000 people who are taxpayers in New Orleans who would like to have the vote. And Lincoln then endorses black voting rights for these literate as well as the. And when Frederick Douglass heard that speech on April 11th, 1865, he was very disappointed that it only applied to veterans of the army, of the military, and to the very intelligent. He said, I and my fellow abolitionists were disappointed by the limited scope, but we should have recognized that that was a very significant speech because Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, you take a wedge, and you put the thin edge of the wedge in, and then you drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known that once he publicly called for black voting rights, he was inserting the thin edge of the wedge. And you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And so the assassination, of course, aborts that. Right. And that's one of the great tragedies of our time.
There are two questions that are really kind of dovetail each other. So the first one is, with respect to why were some areas in Virginia and Louisiana excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation, and why did President Lincoln not make certain that everyone, including the blacks in Texas, know they were free in a timely manner?
So the last question, I think in a lot of ways this is about the reach, the movement of U.S. soldiers, right? The idea is that places that are actively in rebellion are places where emancipation is going to happen, and places that are have been retaken by the U.S. military, in theory, those places are not actively in rebellion. So that's part of the limitation. But I think that the point about Texas emancipation, which is speaking to the problem of Juneteenth, the late notice of emancipation in that part of the country, that's a product of the limited reach of the military. And really, it's a product of, it's a reflection of, I think, a key limitation of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln says slaves in Alabama are free, but he's not in charge in Alabama, right? And so what Lincoln is doing is, again, really radically transformative. He's opening a door to emancipation, but what's necessary is for black folks to find that door and find out how to walk through it, right? And so I think it's the limitation here is a limitation of the reach of the president, the reach of the military in the midst of the war.
But the reason that he exempted those parishes in Louisiana and those counties and cities in Virginia is that the only justification for the Emancipation Proclamation that was legal and constitutional was to subdue the rebellion. And you can't take the slaves from these people who've been subdued.
Right. There's no rebellion.
You're right. Yeah. You're not undermining their ability to continue the war.
Yeah. And it's sorry,
Sure.
I'm just thinking, it's one of the things I noticed in the documents y'all chose, and I don't know if that was intentional or not, is a lot of Lincoln's language is very dry. It's like so deeply legal,
right,
because he's being very technical, right? Like the only, I don't know, this might be an overstatement. The only thing that stands out to me as beautiful about the Emancipation Proclamation is that thenceforward and forever free, right? Everything else is a lawyer, right? Yeah, and so it's written by a lawyer, and I think that that's both of those things are important in terms of who he was, right? He was very specific and particular and technical, but he also had these he could have brilliance in terms of the beauty of his writing.
How different do you believe the Reconstruction era would have been under Lincoln instead of Andrew Jackson?
Andrew Johnson.
Andrew Johnson, excuse me. There's a big difference.
Well, it's another one of these questions that I think is tough for me because it's necessarily speculative, right? I think that the point that I made, the point that you made, Michael, that you said that Douglas has made, that Lincoln would split the rail, right? We can see that Lincoln was evolving, and even that he was evolving quickly as circumstances progressed. And so we can think and we can hope that Lincoln would have pushed for policies that were for the time radical in terms of creating racial equality. At the same time, if back to the last thing I said about the sort of limits of the reach of the executive, the reach of the military, the policies of Reconstruction as they existed were radical, right? The 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, these were incredibly radical. But by 1880, Douglas is able to say that these amendments are a dead letter in most of the South because the reach of the government was not there to make real the legal equality that had been created in the Constitution. And so Lincoln was not going to go personally into the South and eradicate the Klan, right? Even as the government did a lot to suppress that, and even as the Klan was only one manifestation of the forces that challenged racial equality, those forces were massive and extensive. And
they were massive and extensive, but it does speak to this idea of leadership, though, because you would think part of that evolution of Lincoln would lead him, just as it did to declare the Emancipation Proclamation, to sort of at the same time have that moment at Gettysburg, that sort of reconciliation of relating to the men who gave their lives, that he would have continued in that evolution, and this idea of the South holding on to the vestiges of slavery in the form of Jim Crow and other means, the Klan, you think he would have just let that happen?
No, but I don't know that neither did Grant, right? I think it's important to
Right.
recognize that Grant was in charge for a lot of Reconstruction. But would he have been able to eradicate racism in the hearts of Americans? No, I don't.
Right. That's a fair point, because we're still working that issue out. So this was an interesting question. What opposition, external or within himself, did Lincoln face in the final months before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in January of '63?
Well, the principal concern he had was what I alluded to earlier, that you don't want to issue an Emancipation Proclamation which will be regarded as insincere and a desperate practical measure. Now, he emphasizes that it is a practical measure only because he feared, and this is one of the reasons that the Emancipation Proclamation is here on my tie, with a little lunch I see, and the reason he did that was because he feared that that the emancipation of slaves would be challenged in the courts. And let's remember, the Supreme Court was then still presided over by Roger Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision. And so he wanted to make it constitutionally bulletproof. And that's why he bends over backwards. And a lot of people criticized him, because here's this guy who has remarkable ability to generate soaring rhetoric and appeal to the deepest and most positive feelings of liberalism and generosity and progress. And he has these cramped documents with all this, and you think, but then he in the second message to Congress in December of 1862, he talks about how it's some magnificent language about the meaning of Reconstruction, of emancipation, and speaks in very glowing moral terms, very soaring moral terms. So he felt that way, but the legal documents were phrased in ways that he hoped would be bulletproof if emancipation were to be challenged in the courts.
Yeah, when I was lieutenant governor, outside my office window on the state capitol grounds was this statue of Justice Taney. Looked at the top of his head every day.
Wow.
So much fun. Two for here. John Brown is my favorite white man in history. That's not me. This is the person saying this, Maceo. What was Lincoln's reaction to John Brown's raid, and how much had he known of John Brown pre-raid? And companion question, can you compare Lincoln's views on race to those of someone like John Brown?
There's a lot there. Maybe I'll try to tackle a couple of pieces of this. I think Brown was relatively well known after his actions in Kansas as a sort of leading villain of that space, a known attacker and murderer, I guess, of a number of pro-slavery settlers in what came to be called Bleeding Kansas. And I can't think of anything specific to quote. I suspect Michael might be able to, but I suspect that Lincoln, like the vast majority of other white Northerners, was outraged and concerned about what Brown had done. And you know, part of how we can think about this is that even Frederick Douglass was concerned. I wouldn't say outraged, but concerned about what Brown had done, in part because Douglass was technically a co-conspirator, given that he knew some of the details of what Brown was planning. The reason, I'm gonna try to be brief. The reason the question about racial views is so complicated is because Brown, as far as we know, was really deeply invested in black freedom and embraced black people as a part of his political projects. But I almost don't know, I don't know how much Brown really thought of anyone as his equal. Like, I think of the way that he developed his plan to go to Harper's Ferry and sort of recruited these men, but then didn't really have much of a real plan beyond going there, and essentially ended up making himself a martyr. In so doing, made all these other men, black and white, some of whom were his own sons, made them martyrs as well. And so Brown talked much more radically about racial equality than Lincoln did. I don't know how much that actually did for the people around him. I guess so that's part of the tension there for me.
Well, Lincoln said, apropos of Brown, as many Republicans did, we applaud his anti-slavery views, we deplore his tactics. And let's remember, his tactics were to take broadswords and slaughter, chop up people in cold blood, because they were supposedly supporting slavery. And not people who had actually participated necessarily in any of the actions against the town of Lawrence, but we don't want to get into the weeds there. So, but anyway, but Lincoln, the argument that I've made in my book, the Black Man's President, which is taken from Douglas's 1865 speech, June 1st, is that Lincoln was instinctively racially egalitarian. And when he makes that statement that is so widely quoted, that we heard today at the Charleston debate against Stephen A. Douglas in 1858, that's paying lip service to the voters who were being appealed to in the most demagogic, outrageous fashion by Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was saying this country was made by white men, for white men, the government, and black people don't have any right to have it. No social, legal, political rights, forget it. And Lincoln, and Douglas launches his campaign on July 9th, 1858 in Chicago. Lincoln happens to be in town, law case, so he then gives a speech on July 10th. And he attacks Douglas for this racial demagoguery. And he said at the close of his speech, this was a really important speech, he says, let us stop all this quibbling about this man and this race and that race being inferior and must be placed in an inferior position. Let us discard all these things and unite as one nation, once again declaring that all men are created equal. And Douglas goes right after him and hammers him and hammers him and hammers him, and it was working. The voters of Illinois were arguably the most racist of the people in the free states. And so Lincoln was faced with this dilemma. If I don't respond to Douglas's taunts, that guarantees his victory. And the most dangerous person in the country, Lincoln believed, who was most likely to make it possible for slavery to expand everywhere, was Stephen A. Douglas. So he felt that he had to defeat Douglas, not just for his own vanity and his own political ambition, but Douglas was a really dangerous guy, and that he was trying to convince the public that there was no moral dimension to slavery, and that if he won the election, and he did so by anesthetizing the public about the morality of slavery, then the Supreme Court would then take a hint and say slavery is legal everywhere, and it's going to be legal in New York and Maine and everywhere.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, gentlemen.
And thank you, Michael. And I hope our DC audience has enjoyed this or found it useful and purposeful as we really drill down on the fact that the DC story is the American story. So when we talk, every president lives here, or at least after, as of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams for a minute. But there are some presidents and some federal officials who had a particular impact upon Washington, D.C., and we upon them. And that is the purpose of these conversations in this series. I really want to thank again the Ford's Theater. They've been magnificent. I want to thank Kellogg Foundation, Community Foundation, Events DC, Destination DC, and also to those three working members of our Senior Advisory Committee, Carol Falk, Mark Thompson, and of course, I'm going to come back to him again, our distinguished Michael Steele. Dr. Burlingame and Dr. Bonner, you were terrific, and you've really enriched this evening. And again, thank you, Washington, D.C., for joining us tonight, participating tonight, and hopefully we've enriched each other. And until the next time when we talk about Frederick Douglass.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.